You know, leftist teachers and administrators are indoctrinating the next generation. That's why the conservative student in your life needs Young America's Foundation. Students ages 13 and older can apply for YAF's individual membership program and connect with like-minded students. Learn from leaders of the conservative movement, gain skills and materials to advance their ideas, and much, much more. Apply today at www.yaf.org and receive a free membership pack. Again, that's www.yaf.org. Please check it out. Welcome to the McCarthy Report, the podcast where I, Rich Lowry, discuss with Andy McCarthy the latest legal and national security issues. This week, what else? The controversy over the January 6th committee. You're listening to a National Review podcast. You've listened to the podcast on nationalreview.com. We're delighted to have you, but it'd be easier for you and better for us if you made us part of your feed at any of the streaming services out there, from Spotify to iTunes. And please give this podcast and Andy McCarthy the glowing, indeed gushing, 5-star reviews they deserve on iTunes. And now, without further ado, I welcome to this very podcast, through the miracle of Zoom, none other than Andy McCarthy.
Rich, how are you?
Good. How's it going?
It's going fine. Are you still on your boycott?
I am, yeah. There's been a little leakage. By boycott refers to I'm not following any Yankee scores or games during the game and not even reading about them afterwards. But I've taken... At the height of my boycott, I didn't know for days whether the Yankees had won or lost. Now I'm cheating a little bit. I'll ask friends the morning after or so. But yeah, I saw a New York Post headline. We're recording Friday morning. They played the Red Sox last night, and I saw the New York Post headline. This was a wild and brutal Yankee loss. It's like, okay, I'm glad my boycott mostly.
So your mental health is better then. That's good.
Yes. Yeah, because you know how it is. You go to sleep and you're thinking about this key play. It could have gone differently, and I'll come back. But it's been a good break. So we got a lot to chew on, beginning with the committee, the January 6th committee. So had these picks from McCarthy, 5 picks, including Jordan and Banks, and Pelosi's like, nope, we're not doing Jordan and Banks. Who's right? Who's wrong here? Who's being smart? Who's being stupid?
Well, I think they're all being stupid and they're all wrong. It's such a Washington story. I mean, it was, I think, really dumb for the reasons that we've talked about over some of our more recent podcasts, for McCarthy to really, I mean, the way he's kowtowing to Trump is really embarrassing. I mean, it's one thing for him to have to deal with the dynamic he has to deal with, which we've talked about a number of times. But in this instance, he dithered. The Democrats were going to have this committee, and they were going to do this no matter what. They have a right to do it. It's the kind of thing that Congress, if you could put up the politics aside, which you never can, this is the kind of thing that Congress absolutely has a right to and should investigate. This is an attack on the Capitol, on the Congress's turf itself. So, of course, Congress should look into it, which is why the Senate committees looked into how the security personnel had dropped the ball on the day of the protest that turned into a riot. So Pelosi certainly has legitimate reason to do this. And, the politics of it are obvious. They want to play up this whole idea of white supremacism as the country's leading national security threat, fueling domestic terrorism. They want to use the Capitol riot to cap that theme, which obviously, politically, that's something that they have every reason to exploit. So she's got political reasons to do it. And the main political reason she has is that this is a very uncomfortable issue for the Republicans. It shows all the fissures in the party. It brings them to the fore, and it puts the Republicans in a very tough spot when they ought to be uniting on opposing Biden's agenda and riveting everybody's attention to that. Over here, you have Trump, who wants to continue litigating the 2020 election. The January 6th committee obviously is a circumstance where Trump is very interested, and he wants people on the committee who are going to defend him and the run up to January 6th and what happened on January 6th, et cetera. So McCarthy has a choice. Do you pick people who are going to do a good faith, serious investigation of January 6th, which doesn't have to be something that's harmful to the Republicans? You can be pressing the question of why the security breakdowns, why are the Democrats so selectively interested in this particular rioting, but they don't want to even discuss or look at the rioting that was done after the George Floyd killing. There's a sensible position you could take. But what McCarthy ended up doing was, for a while, dithering about whether he was going to participate at all, which seemed to me to be silly. If you're not in there, you can't really shape what the committee does. And if the public was going to be interested in it, you want to be involved in it and active and trying to shape it. And then, before he decided to participate, he ends up running up from Washington to Bedminster here in New Jersey to meet with Trump. And then, after consulting with Trump, announces that he's putting, two of the biggest Trump apologists in the House on the committee, in Jim Jordan and Jim Banks, which was a clear signal that what they intended to do was use the committee to defend Trump, which is obviously what Trump wants. And I think, McCarthy has every right to do this. They're his positions to fill. He's got the right to be wrong, so he can put on there whoever in his caucus he wants to put on. And that's what he chose. It's not what I would have done. I think it was, foolish, but it was his thing to do. And then Pelosi decides to nix his main pro-Trump choices of Banks and Jordan, which I guess technically, because the House is a majority rules body, she has the power to do, but it's a really stupid thing for her to do, and it sets a precedent that's going to blow up on her. So I think she's wrong. I think McCarthy's wrong. And ultimately, what it probably does is it confirms for whoever in the country actually cares about this, it confirms to half the country that this is a partisan stunt. No matter what Liz Cheney says about it, about how, they're going to do a serious investigation and it's going to be sober and well done. I just don't see how anybody, not just in the Trump camp, but among Republicans. I mean, if I were a Republican, I would be really angry that Pelosi did this, even if I wasn't crazy, which I'm not, about the people that McCarthy tried to put on the committee. And I'd be asking, however outrageous you may think Jordan and Banks have been in some of their public commentary, how is it that they're not fit to be on the committee, but Adam Schiff and Jamie Raskin are? I mean, that's, Pelosi loaded up her side of this, aside from Liz, with some of the most partisan anti-Trump Democrats who have said some of the most outrageous things that you could possibly say. And Schiff, I'd say this about Raskin too, to a lesser degree, but Schiff has a demonstrated history of being in charge of an important fact-finding exercise when he was running the Intelligence Committee and they were looking at Russiagate. And he suppressed all kinds of evidence. There's all kinds of indication that he was saying publicly that there was lots of evidence of Trump being in a collusive relationship with Russia. And then 2 years later, when we finally get to read the transcripts of what was going on, it turns out there was no evidence. And he sat on some of the most explosive stuff for a couple of years.
So, Andy, what's wrong with Jordan and Banks besides being pro-Trump? Or they're areas where they've just clearly gone too far, that in a way that would, I mean, obviously once McCarthy picked them, you don't think Pelosi should have nixed them, but why do you think McCarthy shouldn't have picked those two?
Well, I think strategically McCarthy shouldn't have picked them because I don't think it helps Republicans to look publicly like they're in a position of being Trump's defense lawyer, because there's some things that happened on January 6th that are simply indefensible. And I also don't think, it's one thing to say it's very popular among Trump's base to keep talking about whether it was a good faith position to say that the electoral votes shouldn't have been counted and these court challenges should have been followed through on. But for most of the rest of the country, Rich, the polling on this is bad. And I don't think it's going to help Republicans. I don't think the country liked what they saw on January 6th, even if they're convinced, as I am, that the Democrats are blowing it way out of proportion into something that it wasn't. It was still a very bad thing, and it still turns people off, as it should. So I don't see how it helps them to be defending that. Now, on Pelosi's side of this, I have a kind of a 14th Amendment theory on what I thought she was doing, and I have misgivings about it because there's a flaw which I'll get to. But when I first heard this announced, I said to myself, now I understand what she's up to. And this has to do with the fact that when we talked about this at the time of the impeachment, the Democrats put in the impeachment an allusion to the 14th Amendment, and specifically Section 3 of the 14th Amendment, which basically says if you've aided and abetted an insurrection, you're not eligible to hold certain offices under the United States. Now, at the time that they put that in, I thought it was telling, and it was kind of sneaky, although there was a lot of reporting about the fact that the Democrats were working with progressive academics on this. This allusion in the impeachment article really didn't have a lot to do with Trump, I don't think, because if you look at the 14th Amendment, it excludes the president and the vice president from the list of offices that people are ineligible for if they've engaged in or aided an insurrection or rebellion. That's what the 14th Amendment says. So, and I think the exclusion of the president and the vice president is obviously intentional, not only because there's a long list and it's odd that they're not listed, but also because among the offices that you can't hold is to be an elector for the presidency or the vice presidency. So it can't be that they just overlooked mentioning the president and the vice president. So I never thought that passage was, even though it was in the impeachment article, I didn't think it was about Trump. I thought it was about the 100+ Republicans in Congress who supported Trump's Stop the Steal effort, where they were going to, vote against counting the electoral votes, and they signed on to that case that Texas brought, the AG of Texas brought in the Supreme Court. And I've always thought they were laying the groundwork to make available to progressive groups an argument that people who participated that Republicans in Congress who supported Trump on not counting the electoral votes, the Democrats' theory is that that's the igniter of the insurrection, right? So what they want to say is anyone who participated in that effort is culpable for the insurrection. So I thought that what she might be doing with Jordan and Banks by excluding them is basically saying, look, under our theory of what happened here, they're not eligible to be members of Congress. And what this commission or this committee is about is establishing that an insurrection occurred and that it was triggered by Trump's effort to not get these to not allow these electoral votes to be counted, so that Jordan and Banks would be in a position of using the committee to fight for their own political survival. And I thought that was probably her theory. Mm-hmm. Now, here's the hole in my theory. Nels also voted against counting the electoral votes. So it's not just Jordan and Banks, it's Nels. And she said that she was going to allow Nels to be seated on the committee, but not Jordan and Banks. So you have to ask, if I'm right about the 14th Amendment, why not Nels and why these other guys? And the only thing I could say about that is, obviously, Jordan and Banks are higher profile people than Nels. And I think Pelosi's a little bit skittish about taking the position that opposing the counting of electoral votes is such a frivolous, outrageous position that it should be disqualifying, because Jamie Raskin did it in 2016 in connection with Trump. And she also has other members of her caucus, Pelosi does, who did this in connection with Trump's 2016 election and in connection with the two George W. Bush elections. There was an effort not to count Florida by some members of Congress. And then I think in 2004, if I'm remembering right, there was an effort not to count Ohio. So it's hard for Pelosi, I think, to take a hard position that if you support that frivolous application, that makes you ineligible. And I do think they have 14th Amendment on the brain. And I do think the reason they put that in there is to lay the groundwork in the midterm cycle for people to run into court and try to get these Republicans taken off the ballot. But I wish I could be more, I just can't explain the Nels thing if that's what she's got on her mind.
So Andy, one last thing on this. So McCarthy's talked about Republicans forming their own committee. If they did that, would such a committee have subpoena power?
No. Rich, what I think it would be like, and this is another reason why I think it's really dumb to do it. It'd be kind of like, remember in the in connection with the litigation over the election, Rudy Giuliani and some members of Trump's team ran around at some of the states that they were contesting, and they had these kind of informal hearings. And one of them, I think, maybe in Arizona, was actually in the state capitol, but most of them were like in hotels near big ballrooms and stuff. I think that's what this. I hope he doesn't do it. I hope he's just like blowing off steam and he doesn't do it. But it would be farcical. They wouldn't have subpoena power. It wouldn't be an official congressional hearing because they don't have a majority that would commission whatever kind of a cockamamie committee they think they're going to run. And the only reason to do it would be to appease, I think, people in the Trump camp who care about this. I mean, if you take the long view of this, let's talk about Republicans who are not pro-Trump and are not interested in seeing a defense of what Trump's role on January 6th is. What interest would you have in having the Republicans do their own committee? I mean, would I like to see an examination of what the left-wing rioting following George Floyd? I don't know if I need to see that from Congress. I mean, the only relevance of that is that the Democrats are being selectively outraged by this, right? I mean, would we like to see some fact-finding about all that? I suppose. But the only relevant point here is that, the Democrats are being disingenuous and hyping January 6th versus everything else. I don't need a Republican committee for that. Maybe people are of a different mind about that. But what is he going to accomplish by having the Republicans' own committee? What's the point?
So do you want to know anything more about the shooting of Ashley Babbitt? I've sort of come around here where it seems like justified shooting to me and it's been investigated, but it's just bizarre that we know so little publicly when, the average officer involved shooting, in any metropolitan area, you learn more about it than we've learned about this.
Yeah, that's a hard call. Here's where I'm at on that. we can watch the shooting. I mean, I've watched it on video, so I don't really feel like I need to know what happened. I think you can watch what happened, and we understand the circumstances under which it happened. What we don't know, which we would normally know especially when it's Black Lives Matter or it's some left-wing group or it's some officer involved shooting and it's a black suspect, say, we instantly find out who the police officer is. Right. And here that hasn't happened. I think it's not right to treat them differently, but I also don't think we should know the police officer's name unless there's a reason. So my objection is that in most of these cases where we find out the police officer's name, we probably shouldn't. And I don't know whether this officer, who appears to have just done his duty, should he be penalized because we do the wrong thing in all these other cases? I don't think so. And the caveat here is if the Babbitt family has any kind of a wrongful death civil suit and it's not frivolous, then they'll bring it and we'll learn the officer's identity and we'll learn anything else that we don't already know. But if they don't have a case like that, then I'm sort of content to know that there was a shooting. I understand the circumstances under which it happened. The officer had to make a quick decision and made the decision. We can all see it on videotape. There's not a lot of mystery about it. So I understand why it's become such a big cause, but I think it's one of these things, Rich, and there's a number of these we could talk about, but it's one of these things where, you know, it used to be that the Republican conservative position was when the Democrats broke the rules and broke the norms, we would say, we're not them. And we would be happy to not be them. So if we wouldn't be demanding the same things that they demand. Since the rise of Trump, I think it's become more trendy on the right to say that you have to fight fire with fire. And if they break the rules and they break the norms, then we want the advantage of that too. I'm not in that camp. Part of the reason I like being on the right is because I don't want to be that. So, you know, unless there's a very good reason to identify this officer, I don't want him identified.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so let's go to another topic related to some of the debate over January 6th. We had this big expose from BuzzFeed on the Wolverine Watchmen. This is the militia group in Michigan accused of plotting to kidnap Governor Whitmer. We've heard a lot about this. This story was amplified by folks on the right because it raises the issue, and we're talking about this with regard to some of Tucker's allegations about January 6th, of whether this whole plot was hatched by the government and was basically entrapment rather than rolling up people who would have come up with such a scheme on their own. So what should we know about this?
Well, I happen to have done probably the, at least in modern history, maybe in all history for all I know, the most consequential sting operation the FBI and the Justice Department has ever done in the terrorism area. The Blind Shake investigation was an FBI undercover infiltration operation, which is why we were able to stop the so-called landmarks plot, where they wanted to do these simultaneous bombings of the Lincoln and Holland tunnels and the UN and the FBI's headquarters, and they had other targets they were scouting. So I think the best way to look at this, Rich, is the question that I asked the jury toward the end of the case, which is, what would it take to entice you into committing a mass murder attack? Mm-hmm. And I think when you think about that question, and it doesn't have to be a mass murder attack, you can fill in the blanks. You begin to see the absurdity of an entrapment defense in a situation where you're talking about violent crime. Normal people can't be enticed into kidnapping the governor and putting her on trial and killing her, right? The the most notorious entrapment case. Well, I should probably start by saying entrapment obviously is enticing somebody who wouldn't otherwise be disposed to committing a crime to commit a crime. And the legal test of it in federal court, and I think this is the law in most states as well, is that if the suspect either instigates the crime or is predisposed to commit the crime, there's no entrapment defense. So in order to prove entrapment, you have to show that the law enforcement people proposed the crime and that the person was not otherwise disposed to commit it and was enticed into committing it by the law enforcement activity. Now, the case that I'm aware of, which the Supreme Court, I think, decided in the mid 1990s or so, maybe early 90s, which is one way you can actually wrap your head around, is a child pornography case where the postal inspectors spent years trying to get this guy to order child pornography. And they went after him. There were probably a score of mailings over the years. And they went after him again and again and again until he finally ordered something in this catalog that they were peddling. And they arrested him when he went to the post office to pick it up. But they went after him again and again. And there were big issues in the case about whether he would have been interested at all in child pornography if the postal inspectors hadn't put him up to it and hadn't been so aggressive and hadn't, really kept at it for a couple of years before he finally broke down and ordered. Now, I think in a case like that, you can absolutely understand why someone would say the government created that crime and that the person wouldn't have committed it without the government pressure. I don't see how that works in a case of terrorism or in a case of what's alleged in the case involving Governor Whitmer. You can't entice somebody into blowing up a bridge. I mean, what would it take? What do I have to do, Rich, to get you to blow up the bridge? I mean, so look, these cases are always seem ugly. And the reason that you run with entrapment is because usually when the FBI does a sting operation, everything's on tape. All the conversations are on tape. All the scouting of the targets is on video, and they have you dead to rights. So the natural, if you want to try to defend yourself, and they obviously want to try to defend themselves because the time that you're looking at in a case like this is like some of these guys are going to be looking at life sentences probably or something close to it. The best way to try to defend yourself is to say that the FBI created the crime and was too aggressive in pushing people into it. But interestingly, it ultimately becomes more of a nullification defense than an actual legal entrapment defense, because these guys, generally speaking, cannot make out the elements of entrapment. Because usually what has happened is, even if the agents and the informants have been very aggressive, it was a criminal who proposed the scheme, not one of the agents. And once that happens, the agents can be as aggressive as they want to be in trying to push things along, as long as they didn't propose it in the first place. They're allowed, they're on legal sound ground, pushing hard. So what you have to convince the jury is not that you have a legal entrapment defense, but that what the FBI and the government agents did was so aggressive and so over the top that the case just stinks, and you hope that the jury will acquit. And the problem with that approach, again, is that the jury might acquit if it was something like, you go after a guy for 3 or 5 years until he finally orders the child pornography. But if you're talking about like a mass murder attack or a violent crime, the jury's going to give the police a lot of leeway. Now, why are the police so aggressive in these entrapment cases for two reasons. First, what the job of an informant or an undercover is, and the reason that you infiltrate, is because you can't reach the insulated people in a plot usually by the normal techniques of subpoenas and even wiretaps don't always work, because the more insulated people don't go on the phone. They have very few meetings. So having somebody inside is the best way to identify the people who are lurking in the background of conspiracies but don't come to the fore. So one of their jobs, and one of the big complaints I see in the BuzzFeed case, is that they were very aggressive about arranging meetings and paying for meetings and paying for meals and that sort of stuff to see who would show up. Well, that's the way that you smoke people out and you get them to identify themselves. You still can't convict them unless you show that there's evidence that they're actually conspiring to commit some kind of a crime. But a big part of having the informant there is to smoke out the people who you wouldn't otherwise be able to identify. The other thing is, in every entrapment case, what someone is going to argue is, I wasn't predisposed to do this. I'm not a bad guy. I wouldn't have done this if the FBI hadn't pushed so hard. So what the Bureau informants and agents are trained to do is make big provocative statements to make it clear what everybody's intention is. So like, there's this thing in the BuzzFeed story that says, look, if you're not up for kidnapping the governor, you don't need to be here now. And that sounds
pretty
crazy.
Good to leave the room.
Yeah, well, but if you don't leave the room, then you're in.
Right.
And it's hard to argue to the jury that you're not. So what ends up happening in a lot of these cases is especially if you get a good informant, they seem like the driving person, and they're almost the narrator of the crime, but they're taught to be that because what the defenses are going to be at trial. And you need to have these conversations that'll refute that. Here's the last thing I would say about this, and this is the most important. In the terrorism attacks, the 8 years of terrorism attacks that went on from the time that World Trade Center was bombed in 1993 till the World Trade Center was destroyed in 2001, right? We had the Trade Center bombing, we had our landmarks plot, Khobar Towers, the coal, the embassies, and 9/11, right? We stopped exactly one plot, and that was my case, the landmarks case. I'd like to think it was because we had such a brilliant prosecutor running the investigation, but we had the same quality of prosecutors and investigators and everything else in every one of these cases. The only difference was, in my case, we had an informant who infiltrated the cell and was able to tell us in real time what they were planning to do. And that was the only one we stopped. And the point is, the only real way that you are ever going to have real time, I mean, every now and then you hit a home run with a wiretap or a bug, like in the big Gambino case in the against John Gotti. I guess it was probably the late 80s or the 90s. They hit a home run. They got that bug in the Ravenite Social Club, which was the place where they had their big meetings. And they had a lot of meetings there, and they were probably able to prove the case just out of that. But that's unusual. It's not, usually if you get a device in a very effective place where they have a lot of meetings, it turns out that they don't have meetings there for very long, or something always goes wrong. It's fleeting. The way you get in and stop things is by having an informant, or even more than one, infiltrate what's going on. It's actually good to have more than one, because especially if you don't trust some of your informants, to be able to compare information is always good. But if you have somebody inside, you can stop things from happening. If you don't have somebody inside, you're probably in the position of prosecuting after something bad has happened. So what I would just say about it is, it's not only a worthwhile but a necessary tool in an area like terrorism, and it's probably something we should use where the crimes aren't that serious.
So was there anything in particular in the BuzzFeed story that struck you as unusual or worse, disturbed you, or was it all for you like, yep, this is how a sting operation works. This is how informants work?
I guess I was largely, my reaction to this was this is how these stings work. But what came rushing back to me also was a problem that's unique, especially to domestic terrorism. I mean, I had less of this problem because even though all the activities in my case were domestic, it was a foreign terrorist organization. And we were dealing with, some people who were non-Americans and some people who were overseas. And, what their array of rights are is different from what American citizens domestically under the Constitution. And, this is not a situation where we don't have a lot of history. The FBI had very active cases on domestic terrorism in the 1970s and 80s and ended up losing a lot of those cases, dismissing them ultimately without prosecuting them because of the COINTELPRO scandal, where they were, basically doing illegal searches and doing a lot of things that they weren't allowed to do, that they thought would be scandalous if it was exposed by a public trial and would have resulted in a lot of evidence being flushed. But the lesson out of that, and the reason that you have so many stepped up guidelines for things like FISA, and why the government is so hesitant to use counterintelligence measures when you're investigating domestically as opposed to investigating foreign people overseas, is there's always a tension in the terrorism area, domestic terrorism area, between protected constitutional activity and where you cross the line into incitement or plotting crime. And what these guys are arguing, and it's hard to parse it all out defendant by defendant, we'll have to see how it all plays out, but what a lot of them are saying, Rich, is that the evidence of me actually doing anything that's illegal is nil. That I went to training camps, which are totally legal. You don't have to be plotting in order to go to a training camp.
Target practice.
Right. And what they're saying is they're taking my showing up at a training camp and coupling it with my Facebook posts, where I have a lot of stuff about the Second Amendment, and I have a lot of stuff about how I can't stand Governor Whitmer because of these suffocating restrictions in the COVID era, et cetera. And they're trying to knit my constitutionally protected speech and my legal activity and show either that I was involved in a crime when I didn't know there was a crime, or I was predisposed to commit a crime when all I was doing was acting lawfully and acting in a way that's constitutionally protected. You see that kind of defense a lot. Here it looks like it might have some legs because you have some people who don't see whose connection to the main scheme looks like it could be kind of fuzzy, but they have a lot of evidence of them training, and they have a lot of their social media posts. The principle of law that matters here is, and we had a lot of this with the Blind Sheikh, because they were making political statements, and they were making a lot of anti-American statements, and they were a lot of the things that were seemingly commands to violence were kind of buried in the middle of religious sermons. So you had a lot of First Amendment type arguments. The rule of law is that the First Amendment protects you from the criminalization of your speech. So that, for example, I can't make a law that says you can't say I don't like Biden, or you can't say I don't like the president. That the uttering of those words is a crime. That's what the First Amendment protects you from. The First Amendment does not protect you from the use of your speech to prove other crimes that are not the speech itself. So if you're indicted for plotting to kidnap the governor, you don't have First Amendment protection for utterances that you made, statements that you made that are being used as evidence of that crime. But what's going to be the knotty issue for the judge is it's got to be relevant evidence of the crime. So if you're out there, basically saying, I love the Second Amendment, or, I want to be part of a militia because that's what it says in the Second Amendment and that's what we're promoting. In order for them to get that into evidence, they're going to have to somehow show that that's relevant to the crime that's charged, which is kidnapping the governor. And I think the judge is going to be the judge should be very stingy about how much of that stuff you let in. And a lot of that's going to depend on what the defense is. The reason a lot of speech conduct comes in is because sometimes the defense is, I didn't intend this, or I had no idea about this. And then you've opened the door for a lot of your speech that might not otherwise be relevant to come into the trial.
So let's hit another topic before we go, Andy. Obviously, Trump's relationship with Bill Barr is not in a great place. Trump went from loving Bill Barr to having kind of a tenuous relationship with Bill Barr to now open warfare with Bill Barr. And
Right.
One of the latest things here was when Biden was about to give his speech in Philadelphia, his travesty of a voting rights speech. Trump released this letter from Barr to the U.S. attorney, the Trump appointed U.S. attorney in Philadelphia, Bill McSwain, trying to prove that Bill Barr was shutting down the vote fraud investigation. So we can't trust anything Bill Barr says on this. What should we make of this one?
Yeah, well, first, the letter is from McSwain to Trump. Barr's not a participant in the letter. And interestingly, the letter, I think, is dated June the 9th, and Trump ran with it on July 13th. So he sat on it for a while before he sprung it on the 13th. And I think he did that because he wanted to talk about voting fraud in Philadelphia, and he knew that Biden was about to speak about election law in Philadelphia. So that was the explanation of the timing of it. But I think, Rich, this is another iteration of the Trump problem for Republicans. Barr is a very good guy. Bill McSwain is a very good guy. Bill McSwain was an excellent U.S. attorney in Philadelphia. The only reason that most people in the country who know of him is because he was like white on rice every time Larry Krasner, the crazy progressive district attorney of Philadelphia, did something Larry Krasner like. McSwain was all over it, trying to figure out if there was a way to take something the state should have been taken care of as a law enforcement problem and figure out, federal jurisdiction to at least give the people of that area some protection from law enforcement. So he's a good guy. And I hate to see them drawn into something like this, which they're being drawn into on account of Trump. But I think a lot of this goes to the fact that McSwain wants to run for governor, and he obviously would like Trump's support. So Trump clearly wanted out of him a letter about what went on in the voting fraud investigations in Pennsylvania, particularly in Philadelphia, which Trump was pushing very hard. And McSwain couldn't truthfully say that Barr told him not to investigate. So he tried to write a letter, as Barr later said. Barr ended up talking to McSwain once Trump went out and said that the letter said something that didn't say. Barr actually spoke to McSwain, and what Barr says is McSwain told him he was trying to thread the needle. He didn't want to say anything that was not true, but he wanted to give Trump something that Trump could use. So what he ends up saying in the letter is that he was very concerned about all of the indications, especially what Trump was talking about in terms of voting fraud. And Barr stopped him from making public statements about voting fraud. So Trump represented that what the letter said was that Barr had told McSwain not to investigate. And in fact, Barr told McSwain not to make any public statements about voting fraud investigations, which is a very different thing, obviously. And then the other thing McSwain says in the letter is that the Justice Department directed him to give evidence that he had that was developed in some of their investigations to the state. And the state attorney general is this guy, Shapiro, who publicly was kind of the face of the litigation against Trump. You know, when the pro-Trump people were bringing litigation in Pennsylvania, Shapiro was the guy who was fighting back. And it turns out that Shapiro is probably going to be the Democratic candidate for governor. So, you know, McSwain, if he gets to run, may end up running against Shapiro. So that whole dynamic is going on. But what McSwain says in the letter is, I was told by the Justice Department to give my evidence to Shapiro, even though Shapiro was in the tank for Biden and said publicly that you couldn't win the election. Well, yes, it's true that Shapiro was in the tank for Biden and that Shapiro said publicly that Trump couldn't win the election, but that doesn't mean that you don't give the evidence to the state authorities. What people don't understand generally, and I look, until I was in law enforcement, I didn't know this either. Because we have state elections, we don't have one big federal election, we have 50 state elections. Election irregularities tend to be violations of state law. So even if the federal agencies and the U.S. attorney's offices and the FBI, even if they go out and investigate them, they often don't find federal crimes. They find what might be state crimes. And the only thing you can do as a federal prosecutor is give it to the state authorities. Now, if they're politicized and they don't pursue the investigations, then you have something to complain about. But you have to give them the evidence. I mean, that's what every federal prosecutor in the country knows that. So McSwain ends up writing this letter that Trump uses to say that Barr told Philadelphia or told McSwain in the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, don't investigate vote fraud. And if you find evidence of crimes, give it to these people who are in the tank for Biden. And in point of fact, what Barr told McSwain was, you can't make public statements about investigations, which is Justice Department policy. And Barr says, I never even talked to McSwain about giving evidence to Pennsylvania. The Justice Department told him, and I'd be surprised he needed to be told this, because every federal prosecutor in America knows this. If you get evidence and you don't have a federal crime, but you think it might be a violation of state law, you give it to the state prosecutors. So again, it's a situation where, you know, Trump in a public statement got up and basically said, you know, Barr double-crossed him and wouldn't let the state authorities investigate election fraud. And in the meantime, what everybody might remember is that Barr took a lot of heat from both Democrats and the media by issuing a memo that instructed all U.S. attorneys to investigate substantial allegations of voter fraud, because the usual Justice Department policy is you have to go through the voting rights division in the Justice Department. And in this instance, what Barr put this memo out, I think it was on November 8th or November 9th, because if you had to do everything through the Justice Department, including, you know, get approval to interview witnesses and that kind of stuff, the date for certifying the state elections, I think, was December 5th. Maybe it was December 8th. I just don't remember what it was. But I mean, they had a month to figure out whether there was fraud or not. So if you had taken everything through the Justice Department, they never would have been able to do it. And as Barr has pointed out, if he hadn't told the federal prosecutors to investigate, then he would not have had any credibility telling Trump that there was no election fraud and making that statement to the country. So he gets it on both ends. And I know I often sound like Barr's lawyer, but I think this is really unfair in this instance. When he told them to investigate, he gets all kinds of crap from the Democrats and the media for doing that. And then now he's got Trump out there saying that he told them not to investigate, which isn't true. Right. So, they get you coming and going.
Well, that's all the time we have. This podcast has been produced by the incomparable Sarah Schutte. Thanks to everyone for listening. And thank you, Andy McCarthy.
Thanks, Rich.